Hey folks, David Stewart here. Time for a bit more Storycraft. Today we are going to be talking about a character rather than a character archetype or some literary technique, and that character is Robin Hood, because Robin Hood has been used a lot, has appeared in many different kinds of media over the years. There was even a Sunday comic strip that I used to see with Robin Hood in it in the newspaper. Most of our modern depictions of Robin Hood, who's a legendary character, probably historically didn't exist, and if he did exist historically was probably quite different from these modern depictions we have of him. Most of our modern sensibilities about Robin Hood really go back to Sir Walter Scott and the 3-volume book Ivanhoe, which if you've never read, I think because it's in the public domain, you really don't have anything to lose by at least attempting to read it. It is maybe a little bit less accessible than a modern work because it was written in the 19th century and utilizes a lot of 19th century idioms and language, but I find it pretty readable, and I think there's some really good stories in there, and there's a lot of flavor to medieval England, and certainly I think Ivanhoe is responsible for a lot of kind of medieval revivalism that existed in the 19th century all the way through to today. So we've really had like 200 years of different depictions of Robin Hood, kind of being riffs off of what Sir Walter Scott did with Robin Hood. And depending on what the writer wants to do with Robin Hood, which is why I find him such an interesting character, is the writer can use Robin Hood to present really two different political stances or political perspectives. And you will often have politicians or other people, when they are talking politics, will invoke Robin Hood, usually robbing from the rich and giving to the poor, as some sort of ideal that is worth pursuing. And that's really kind of what I want to dig in here today, is there's really two faces to Robin Hood, depending on who's doing the storytelling. Now, if we start with Sir Walter Scott, this Robin Hood is really a very virtuous character. He's an outlaw, but he's an outlaw due to unjust reasons. And so most of our various riffs are going to have that. Robin Hood is an outlaw because he's forced to be an outlaw. In a lot of cases, he has a noble birth, but something happens to take away that, that noble status. Like he comes home and like his home is destroyed. He comes home from the Crusades. He's on the Crusades with Richard the Lionheart, and he comes home early and finds that his lands have been confiscated by Prince John, who's trying to usurp King Richard. So he represents a force working against tyranny for the restoration of the correct authority. So that's one of the first perspectives, is really something that is really not very modern, which is the belief in the divine right of kings. Richard is doing things which are immoral, not just because they're immoral on the face of what he's doing, like taxing or something like that, but rather he is usurping the actual divine right of Richard the Lionheart, the real King of England. And he is basically taking Richard's power in a way that is immoral. And so Robin Hood represents the proper moral restoration of the king. And so that's a perspective that I think a lot of people lose as we get further away from monarchy and further away from the idea of divine right of kings, or, various different versions of that exist in other cultures as well. So that's the first one. And the second one that you get is Robin is an outlaw because of maybe Marxist perspective. So he's often evoked by Marxists, not so much in the story. Sometimes you see this perspective in stories, but more often you see him just evoke this idea of robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. So the outlaw of Robin Hood steals money from the rich, who have their money due to some immoral reason for having it, and then gives it to the poor people who are in need of the money. And so that was really the other face of Robin Hood. The conservative face of Robin Hood is the restoration of proper authority. The, subversive face of Robin Hood is the outlaw who is acting against the established system, which is tyrannical, to help the common man. And that's the way that he tends to be presented if somebody is evoking him from a more, let's say, a left-leaning perspective. They tend to go with that idea of robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. Now, in media, he's usually presented as doing some combination of these things. He's often stealing money. If we look at the Disney version of Robin Hood, where I think he's like an anthropomorphic fox. That's the main occupation he does, is stealing gold from the Sheriff of Nottingham and Prince John and giving it back to the poor people. But this is really, I guess, a modern riff on this conservative version of Robin Hood, because King John, or Prince John at this time, he becomes king after Richard the Lionheart dies historically, but Prince John is basically immorally stealing money from the poor. The Sheriff of Nottingham is taxing the poor in a way that is harmful to them and is unjust. And so what Robin Hood is doing is he's taking their money and giving it back to the people who the money actually belongs to. In other words, the taxation is theft, and Robin Hood, the outlaw, is restoring their property to them. So Robin Hood is acting kind of like a libertarian vigilante in opposing the I guess, tyrannical taxation. So it does tend to be focused on money, and in this case, the rich is really the government. It's the Sheriff of Nottingham and Prince John. There's no other nobles really assembled that Robin Hood happens to be stealing a lot of money from. And different versions of Robin Hood will have him just stealing money from the nobility, but then you have the nobility portrayed generally as being bad on some level. They are morally corrupt. They're taking the tax money and they're living frivolously with it, and they're squeezing squeezing water from the rock of the poor and doing these other sorts of things to get the money. And so Robin Hood is going to be justified in taking that money back. So when we see him portrayed, we usually see both of these things present in different degrees, but it's really tends to be a matter of emphasis, which one you want to use to talk about the character. If you're trying to present a perspective where it's the nobility's system that is bad, that they're bad because they impose this tyrannical system on people. They steal the value of the workers. They steal the value of the peasants below them and keep them oppressed and do horrible things to them. Then, of course, Robin Hood, as an outlaw, is going to do something good simply by stealing money and giving it back to the poor, who inevitably are going to end up having to give it back to the nobility when the nobility come around and tax them again. But he's doing something that's directly good for them in a monetary sense. In other versions of him, you have him opposing the rule of John in respect to hopefully restoring the order of King Richard. And that's often the conclusion of one of the stories, is King Richard comes back from the Crusades and sets everything right. He puts John in his place. Something bad happens to the Sheriff of Nottingham. In some cases, there is no Prince John, like in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, the Kevin Costner movie, which fun thing, you can look up on YouTube. You can look up some early shots when they were beginning the production of the movie, and Kevin Costner is speaking with this, I guess, a version of an English accent. It's kind of a Cockney accent, and it just doesn't work, and so they had him just speak with an American accent. And I think I remember Patrick Stewart or someone actually defending this. It's like, that's closer to what they probably sounded like in medieval England, was with those hard R's and things like that, rather than, a more received pronunciation with softer R's. Anyway, so now when the Sheriff of Nottingham is the exclusive bad guy, and he's bad in a more traditional villainous kind of way. There's even a part where he's, like, as things are breaking down, he decides he's going to rape Maid Marian, who's Robin Hood's lover. And that's just it's like kick the dog kind of moments. The entire movie tends to be full of those. He kills people without any reason. He's simply an evil guy. And you are missing some of the whole bigger idea about Robin Hood acting as someone purely for justice. He has a more personal reason to be out after the Sheriff of Nottingham, and the restoration of the kingship is a little bit more in the background. The emphasis tends to be a little bit more personal. So you can't have a personal version, but you still have Robin Hood engaging in this basically steal from the government and give back to the people, or steal from the rich, the nobility, which are the government, and give back to the people, depending on how you want it to happen. Now, what's interesting, I think, about some of these is that this conclusion where King Richard returns from the Crusades and sets everything right is historically that didn't happen at all. King Richard, if I remember correctly, never actually made it back to England after the Crusades. He was kidnapped on the way back. He was kidnapped by the Holy Roman Emperor or by agents working for the Holy Roman Emperor, and they had to ransom him back. And then he spent his last years campaigning in Aquitaine, trying to suppress rebellions from his mother's lands, and ended up being killed in battle by an arrow wound. And I think, I'm not sure if this is true, so if anybody knows the history on this, he was shot with an arrow by a boy, and they caught the boy and they brought him in, and he forgave him. But the people who worked for him had the boy like flayed alive anyway, and they had him like tortured to death anyway, even though Richard forgave him and wanted him to be let go. They executed him horribly anyway. So anyway, if somebody knows the historical reality of that might be interesting to know. But yeah, King Richard never actually made it back to England to set things right. He died. John inherited the crown because Richard did not have any legitimate issue. And then King John is considered one of the worst kings in English history, so bad that John the First is John the Last. And I think that's one of the songs in the Disney Robin Hood. John the First, it was sure to be John the Last, I think. No king has been named John. No one in the English monarchy has named their kid John since because of his horrible reputation. And we could go on about like the bad things about John, but he makes a good villain because historically he was just so reviled. He was such an ineffective king. He had such bad policies. He lost so much land that his father, Henry II, had given to him, and he had gained from his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. There were so many different things that he did. I think at one point he married a 12-year-old. He's just a great literary or historical villain for a piece of historical fiction. And indeed, whenever you're doing Robin Hood, there's a historical fiction flavor to the medieval presentation that is very appealing. There's a reason it's been so popular, and it's not just that it can describe these two different halves of robbing from the rich and giving to the poor, robbing from the government, giving to the poor, restoration of the kingship, but it just the medieval flavor is always so appealing. Usually, by the way, it's not portrayed in a completely historical fashion. There's always some anachronism with Robin Hood, but that's I guess that's probably a different subject there. The other thing about Robin Hood is he's always a really good archer, and I'm not sure if that has something very special in it other than he has a skill that would be very useful to thieves, which is to attack somebody from range, right? He doesn't act as a knight with armor going into battle on his horse. Rather, he acts as an outlaw, attacking sneakily from the distance. And so I think kind of a thief-like character is very appealing as well, and has had a lot of influence on other kinds of characters who are going to act in a more outlawish way. They're going to act like thieves or use stealth or things like that to subvert their enemies rather than attack them in the open. So I think it makes a good contrast. If you're reading it in Ivanhoe, it makes a good contrast to the other characters who are, specifically knights. It all kind of makes a well-rounded flavor of different kinds of characters and their motivations and the way that they act in the various stories that are within Ivanhoe. So thanks so much, guys. Leave me your thoughts down below about Robin Hood and the two halves of Robin Hood: robbing from the rich to give to the poor, or usurping the illegitimate government to restore the proper government, the more conservative side of things. And I'll see you guys next time. Have a great one.